That structure that I've described remained astonishingly unaltered until really, well, processes of alteration, of course, were constant, especially from the earlier 19th century. I referred to the burning down of the Palace of Westminster in 1834. That followed 2 years after the first of the great Reform Acts. Now, again, it's really important we understand this. MPs, the members of the lower house, the House of Commons, were always voted for. They were always returned by some form of election. But those who could vote varied immensely from area to area and were always a tiny minority of the population, though a quite substantial one. I mean, the test in most county seats was only people who held 40 shillings worth, that's £2 worth of a year of land. I mean, even then it was a pretty modest figure. So you have many constituencies with quite large electorates. But what is very striking was everywhere else in Europe in the 19th century, there is a process for, we can call it loosely, democratization. Everywhere else in Europe, that process of democratization involves the more or less violent destruction of existing institutions, which is why virtually, I'm not a 19th century historian. Let's use that useful word. Most 19th century European states have revolutions, and several of them, like France, France is always having a revolution, have more than one. Britain doesn't. England doesn't. By this point, it is Britain. You've got created from 1707 the United Kingdom of England and Scotland, with Ireland doing a kind of strange waltz in and out, depending on which period you're looking at. But what happens in England is something completely different. The move for the broadening of the franchise, for the incorporation of new political classes, first the commercial classes and professionals, and then the working class, the skilled worker, and then even women at the beginning of the 20th century. And that takes place in England, not as a clamour to destroy existing institutions, but to become part of it. In other words, it's not a clamour for revolution, it's a clamour for parliamentary reform. And this again entrenches the point that I was making before about the extraordinary hold that these things have on particularly the English imagination. They knew Parliament was the right way of doing things in principle. They just felt that it wasn't broadly representative enough in practice. In other words, that phrase that goes back to the 14th century judges, everybody's represented in person in Parliament, either in person or by their representative, it needed tweaking, it needed bringing up to date, which is exactly what happens. And it's really important we remember this. The fundamental basis of English freedom is the idea of representative government. It is not democracy. We only become a full democracy, that's to say that every adult has the vote, after the First World War. So the democratic experiment in England is barely 100 years old. And I think most of us admit it's looking pretty frail. The thing that has actually, as it were, kept us going is this much broader sense of, forgive me, representative government. So the thing that is the root of our freedom is not democracy. It is this idea of representative government, that government should be answerable, and that there should be fixed property rights and a fixed rule of law. And these things antedate any notion of democracy by hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. It's really important. So there are three sets of changes. The first is the effective elimination of the monarch as the dominant political force. And this, as it were, the altered balance between Crown and Parliament is the great achievement of the Glorious Revolution of 1689. Remember, there are three revolutionary settlements of the 17th century. There's the destruction of the monarchy, which follows the execution and the declaration of a republic, which follows the execution of Charles I in 1649. There is the restoration of a pretty well untrammeled monarchy, not completely, in 1660. And then there is this creation of a parliamentary monarchy, which is what it is, in 1689, in which and that's something. It's very important we understand this. There is never a theoretical loss of royal sovereignty, but what you get instead is the creation of a remarkable office, and it's one that we talk about far too little when we discuss our constitution, and it's the office of Prime Minister, which in its full sense is unique to England, to the British Constitution. And the Prime Minister has got a double function. He manages the king on behalf of Parliament. So he, because he commands a majority in the House of Commons, he is able to, as it were, finally say to the king, you must do what the majority in the House of Commons wants. That's fine. But how do you control a majority in the House of Commons? 600 people, say a majority of whatever it will be, at least 320, 330 people. How do you control 330 arrogant, often pig-ignorant politicians and politicianesses? How do you keep them under control? Well, you need the instruments of power and patronage and place. That's supplied by the Crown. So the Prime Minister also paradoxically controls Parliament on behalf of the Crown. It's Janus-like. It's this double role, and it's very characteristic if you actually look at Downing Street. Downing Street faces in two directions, one facade, the relatively modest townhouse, the number 10 Downing Street, faces towards the Palace of Westminster. The real Downing Street, which is a most elegant, grand early 18th century house, overlooks St James's Park towards originally Whitehall and Buckingham Palace. It's this Janus face, royal and parliamentary. And that's what keeps that's what keeps that parliamentary monarchy in balance. And then the next great change is the one that is between 1910 and, is it 1946? I always thought, does the Parliament Act come in earlier? The Second Parliament Act. They're the Parliament Acts which alter the balance between the House of Lords and the House of Commons. The House of Commons, again going way, way back into the Middle Ages, had prime power over money bills. Nevertheless, the two houses had effectively equal power. The house that was the representative house, the Commons, and the house in which the powerful, the landowners, be they the bishops, remember the bishops are there because they too are great landowners, or the great landowners of the aristocracy, they had equal powers. What the Parliament Acts of 1910 and what was it? I can never remember whether it's 45 or 46. What those two Parliament Acts do, they reduce the House of Lords. They take the power away, the power of the House of Lords to veto bills, and even largely reduce its right to delay bills. So they lead to this, they turn it from, right, if you like, if we go back into the Middle Ages, Parliament consists of three bodies, each of which has quasi-sovereignty: the Crown, the House of Lords, the House of Commons. What progressively happens is that the independent power slowly trickles back simply into the House of Commons. The others remain immense authority. They retain, in the case of the monarchy, the prestige. In the case of the House of Lords, prestige and the ability to delay legislation, and above all to amend legislation. But the final power, that final push, which is why people do occasionally refer to ignorantly the sovereignty of the House of Commons. So that is the next great change. So you alter the scope of the monarchy, the Parliament territorially to include Scotland and then Ireland. Then you alter the balance of power within Parliament. But the greatest set of changes are the changes which are brought about without any form of serious consideration, arbitrarily and casually by the Labour government, by Blair's government from 97 to 2010. And it's impossible to exaggerate the scope of those changes or the danger of those changes. Because what those changes do for the first time in English history, to put it quite simply and quite bluntly, they reduce the power of Parliament. Before that point, Parliament, what the doctrine of parliamentary sovereignty means is Parliament is all powerful. There is no higher source of law. And that was true right through English history. There is the great argument, of course, about notions like natural law or the limitation of the law of the church and whatever. That goes completely by the reign of Henry VIII. Parliament is all powerful. The idea of parliamentary sovereignty states quite simply, and this again has got a nicely modern edge to it, if Parliament legislates, if you pass a statute which declares that men are women and women are men, then in English law they are. That is the nature of English law. In other words, Parliament is the ultimate body. There is no body beyond it. There is no notion of a larger body of law to which parliamentary statute must conform. That is what it actually amounts to. What the Blair government does is to slash away that notion in the most radical fashion.